Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Michigan Trails Reports. I'm your host, Tom Funk, author of 50 Hikes in Michigan's Upper Peninsula and 50 Hikes on the North Country Trail. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Nortive 8, makers of quality hiking boots. Whether you're tackling rugged trails or just enjoying a scenic stroll, Nortive 8 has a boot to keep you comfortable and support you on your next adventure. Visit nortive8.com, and that's the number 8. And as always, thanks Adam Main for the use of his music. Adam is a musician in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and you can find him on Spotify, Amazon, and Apple Music. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the fascinating historical site right near the heart of the Chicago metropolitan area, the Chicago Portage National Historic Site. Now, this location may seem a bit removed from Michigan at first glance, but its history is deeply tied to Michigan history, especially the fur trade and the transport of furs and trade items through the Great Lakes, and especially through Michigan. So let's take a little look at what this site is and why it matters to not just Illinois, but the broader Great Lakes region, of course, including Michigan. All right, so there we go. So the Chicago Portage is now commemorated as the Chicago Portage National Historic Site. It's an important and historically significant route that once connected two of the most critical waterways in North America, the Great Lakes and Mississippi River. It's a narrow, roughly 1 mile corridor that acted as a natural waterway and pathway between the Chicago River, which historically ran to Lake Michigan, and also it connected to the Des Plaines River, which empties into the Mississippi River. And they were only about a mile or so apart, and it was a gentle rise in the landscape to get between the two. And as always, a gentle reminder, this portage was not discovered by Europeans. Credit always goes to the indigenous tribes that have been using these routes since the glaciers started retreating for upwards of 10,000 or more years. And as our European forebears were wandering around the landscape, getting between watersheds was always a challenge, and typically they would look for a portage, or a place where travelers could drag boats and supplies overland between two bodies of water, or even carrying them. Usually this means they're bypassing a section of river or rapids as well. So not only did this portage link the watersheds of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, it, again, was an easy one to maneuver. So it's easy to overlook how integral this small portage was to the development of what we think as modern American infrastructure. This portage was almost lost in development, which is strange because without this portage, there would be no Chicago. Eventually, it dawned on historians and community leaders that the Chicago Portage, this was a key artery that helped shape the course of history of the United States and North America. Early European explorers and fur traders used the portage to bypass natural obstacles along the Chicago River and move trade goods. And indigenous peoples were, of course, the first ones to recognize its strategic significance, using it for centuries before Europeans arrived. But the history of the Chicago Portage doesn't just stop with the Native American trade routes. The European exploration of the Great Lakes and Mississippi River systems would forever change the way the land was perceived and utilized. So, let's take a little better look at how the small little stretch of land became so important. As I mentioned earlier, the Chicago Portage was originally used by the Native American peoples long before European explorers arrived in the region. The Potawatomi, Miami, and other indigenous tribes, even the Hopewell, recognized the natural advantage of this waterway corridor, which made it easier to travel between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. The portage facilitated trade between these tribes as well, allowing them to exchange goods, cultural practices, and even ideas across vast distances. These indigenous peoples developed intricate networks of trails and waterways throughout North America, And this Chicago Portage was just, another one of them, but it was also probably the most important one at the time. Because in the 17th century, the French explorers and fur traders like Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet, they arrived in the region, and they're quickly learning about where they can get between watersheds, and they're getting that information from the local tribes. So this marked the beginning of the European exploration in the area around the time that this Chicago Portage was discovered. So in 1673, it was again Marquette and Joliet. They were the first Europeans to make use of the Chicago Portage. And after journeying down the Mississippi River, they were informed by the Illinois and Kaskaskia, which is south of Chicago. They were informed about the Chicago River, which flowed into Lake Michigan, and that could serve as a route to link to the Mississippi River system, and all they had to do was paddle up the Des Plaines River. So this made for a turning point in the region's history, and it just opened up the Great Lakes to European settlement and fur trading. So folks would go through the Great Lakes, and they would go through the Chicago Portage and hit the Mississippi and westward. So this was a much easier portage than going up to some of the more northern ones that we're more familiar with. So this portage, this facilitated development of French settlements, trading posts, and particularly the area that became Michigan, as now traders could easily move between, say, Montreal and the Mississippi in the west. And although, again, they get credit, that is Marquette and Joliet, for being the first Europeans to use it as intended, there was already French fur traders living along this portage. So although Marquette gets credit, it's only because he kept notes. And the French speakers that were there, they're probably illiterate and did not. So when they were on their way to find the Mississippi, they used the Fox and Wisconsin Portage, which is up by Green Bay, to head over to the Mississippi. And when he went all the way down to where the Arkansas comes into the Mississippi, then they turned around. And on their way back, they gleaned some intelligence from local natives about the Chicago Portage. And he eventually used this portage on his way back to St. Ignace. But unfortunately, he eventually died along the shore of Lake Michigan, somewhere in the Manistee area. So it was the French who were first, and then after the French became the British, and this came after the French and Indian War in the mid-18th century. This whole area became under British control, and later America controlled it after the American Revolution. And throughout these periods, the Chicago Portage remained a key route for settlers, traders, and explorers. During the 19th century, the portage saw increased use as Americans sought to expand westward. Chicago River was deepened and widened, making it even more navigable, and the portage itself became a hub for transporting goods and people between the Great Lakes and Mississippi River. The growing Chicago city would eventually become one of the largest cities in the United States, and it owes its early successes to this portage's existence. Today, the Chicago Portage National Historic Site is a protected area managed by the National Park Service and the Forest Preserve District of Cook County. It's located in the suburb of Lyons, just a short distance from downtown Chicago. While the site is not well known as some of America's more famous national parks, it remains an important location for understanding the early history of the United States and its indigenous peoples. Chicago Portage is now a quiet, forested area, offering a stark contrast to the bustling city nearby. There have been put in interpretive trails, some signage, and a small visitor center that helps bring the history critical to life. So visitors can hike through the historic site. They can follow the footsteps of explorers and traders, which once passed through the same land centuries ago. So if you go there, it's just kind of like this low swampy area, marshy area. So the water's been diverted and raised and lowered, and it's nowhere near what it was, several hundred years ago. Overall, the water levels in the Great Lakes have gone down because the land has been rebounding from the weight of the glaciers. So when you go there, it just kind of looks like a marsh. But my understanding is there were times where there's so much snow melt in the springtime that they could paddle from the Chicago River all the way over to the Des Plaines. So for those that are passionate about hiking history, the Chicago National The Chicago Portage National Historic Site is just a great example of how trail systems can preserve not only the natural landscape, but also the cultural and historical significance of a place. So this is a reminder that the land we hike on has often been used by countless others long before us, each leaving their mark on the trails that we walk today. All right. The Chicago Canal, or known as the Illinois and Michigan Canal. This was an idea that came about when traders were moving through the area. Like, hey, why don't we build a canal? So the Erie Canal, of course, was created in the early 1800s, and they got the idea of creating a canal between Lake Michigan and the Mississippi River, connecting the Chicago River and the Des Plaines River. You may already know that the Chicago River runs backwards. The water actually flows out of Lake Michigan into the Chicago River to the Des Plaines. And they actually have a physical separation between the two. So it's a kind of a cool way of getting trade goods between the two systems. They keep them physically separated, although water does flow from Lake Michigan into the Mississippi now these days. So this was completed in 1848, and this was a huge infrastructure project. It significantly altered the economic and social landscape of the American Midwest, and it stretched from 96 miles from Chicago to LaSalle, Illinois, and it connected the Great Lakes with the Mississippi River system. And this is and still is a vital transportation route for goods and people, and it played a pivotal role in the region's development during the 19th century, fueling the expansion of both Illinois and the broader Midwest. The Illinois and Michigan Canal was conceived as a means to link Michigan with the Illinois River, thereby creating an essential transportation corridor between the two major waterways. So, prior to its construction, they were often, transported in canoe, overland in wagons and things like that. So, just imagine having a water route to move between basically the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. So the canal's route ran through a mix of wilderness and settled lands and traversed areas that would soon become key hubs of industry and commerce. So if you get out a map and you look at it, you'll see that there's a lot of industry built up around this canal. So the canal's completion allowed for, transportation of things like coal and grain, timber, other raw materials, which greatly facilitated the industrialization of cities such as Chicago. And, it's probably why Chicago is such a great, large city. It fostered economic growth and to the agricultural regions of Illinois as well. Construction of the Illinois and Michigan Canal began in 1836 under the direction of Illinois Governor Joseph Duncan. It was completed, more than a decade later. The work involved excavation of the canal itself, the construction of locks, and all the usual necessary infrastructure like tow paths for horses and things like that. The canal was originally designed to accommodate boats and barges with a depth of around 4 feet and a width of 40 feet, allowing for the passage of large cargo vessels. But it became to the point where trains started moving more freight than these canals. So even though the Illinois and Michigan Canal was a key player in the region's economic boom during the 19th century, it began to wane in the early 20th century with the advent of railroads. So these were offering, of course, faster and more reliable means of transportation. By the 1930s, the canal was no longer in regular use for commercial shipping. However, its legacy endured. In the 1970s, the canal was designated as a National Heritage Corridor, and efforts were made to preserve and promote its history and significance. Today, it is a recreational resource with hiking, biking, and boating opportunities along its route. So its historic towpath has been converted to a popular trail, allowing visitors to experience the region's rich history while enjoying the natural beauty of the canal corridor. And as we wrap up this episode, I encourage you to visit the Chicago Portage National Historic Site if you ever find yourself in the Chicago area. It's a beautiful, quiet spot that tells the story of a long, rich history that's deeply intertwined with the trails of Michigan and the broader Great Lakes region. So whether you're hiking in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, if you're exploring North Country Trail, take a moment to think about these trails that connect us all. So they're just not about just getting around. They're about walking through time at some point. So, all right. So there you go. I'll tell you, I have to be honest with you guys. I have never been to this historic site. I've been to Chicago many, many, many times, and I keep telling myself, next time I go, if I fly into O'Hare and I have to rent a car to drive someplace, I'm going to go by there and check out the site. So, all right, thanks again for everybody for listening to the Michigan Trails Report. I'm Tom Funk, and I hope this episode has inspired you to go visit this and appreciate the history of our trails. So, next time, happy trails, happy hiking.